Today, I'm going to show you how I made the pirate dagger props from my most recent short film. The first thing I did was make the handle. For this, I started by cutting a 1/2 inch wide piece of 10mm Cosplay foam, and I made these pieces about 5 inches long. I then cut 2" to 1.25" wide strips of 5mm Cosplay foam and used those as the pieces to go on the outside of the handle. As you can see, I'm using the 10mm pieces to go next to the fiberglass rod that I'm using as the core of the prop, and I'm using the 5mm pieces to sit on the outside in order to completely surround the core with foam and make a decently sized hilt that can be then carved down to a rounder shape. Once I'd carved the corners off of the handle, I then went and sanded it down further with 60 grit and then 150 grit sandpaper. I would have done this with a rotary tool from the beginning, and I did eventually clean it up that way, but my workshop has been temporarily relocated, and I'm not able to sand in this room. So if you have a rotary tool, I would highly recommend that. It's much easier, but if you don't have access to that, as you can see, you can still do just fine with sandpaper and working by hand. The next thing I did was cut a small circular piece that would normally be the weight at the end of the pommel. I did this by cutting into 10mm foam with a sharpened copper pipe to get a nice inch-wide circular piece to fit right on the end. Next, I made the hand guard by cutting a very long pointed oval out of 5mm craft foam. I rounded the corners and then punched a hole to push the fiberglass rod through so that it would sit and stay in place without having to rely entirely on glue. Next, I applied heat to the handguard and used rounded surfaces such as my elbow or a knee to round it out and get it into a more compound curved shape. I then went over the edges with a 150 grit sandpaper to round them out a bit and look less like a harsh cut foam edge. Then I used contact cement to attach the guard to the top of the hilt as well as the bottom and connect the pommel weight to the end. I was originally going to use 2 of the circle pieces to have a larger, more decorative looking pommel weight for this particular dagger, but it ended up being too flimsy and easily removable, and I knew that wouldn't work for a prop dagger, so I just went ahead and took it off. Next, I made the blade out of 5mm craft foam. It was about the same width as the outside pieces of the hilt, so about 1" to 1.25". I used the width of my ruler as reference, and I cut both pieces to about 9 inches long. I then carved a groove down the center to fit around the fiberglass core, and I started doing this by hand with my X-Acto knife, but if you don't have a groove tool, which I plan on getting at some point, this can be a bit difficult, especially if you're wanting to make sure you don't go all the way through the foam. So I ended up cleaning this up, trying to straighten it out a bit, make it more consistent all the way down by using my wood burning tool. And I just took the wedge piece and went straight down that groove a couple of times to clean it up, try and make it as wide as I could without weakening the center of the piece of the foam. I then applied contact cement to the inside surfaces of the blade, using a scrap piece of foam to spread it out and apply it more thinly and evenly. And then I sanded the fiberglass core to give it more surface area to accept the contact cement that I then applied to it, before sandwiching both pieces of foam around the core to create the blade. I had to make the alignment of the blade a bit weird, as I realized my actor would be using this left-handed, but I originally placed the hand cover for a right-handed dagger. So I simply opted to make the blade lopsided and have the handle fit in their hand a bit weird in order to have the blade pointed the right way. I then trimmed off the tip to make everything flush, and then cut 2 angles at the top to create the point, and then sliced off the edges right there to make it a bit more rounded. I then, of course, cleaned up this cut on sandpaper to make it completely round all the way along that edge. Once I had gotten to this point, I stepped outside and used my rotary tool to go over all of the edges that I had already sanded and sharpen out the edges of the blade. As you can see, using a rotary tool does really help. It works really well, and it is a lot easier than trying to sand things by hand. I wasn't able to get video of the process, but you can see the result. And if you do not already have a rotary tool for foam prop making, I would highly recommend it. For the second dagger, I made the hilt in the exact same way. The only difference being that instead of a full hand guard, I made a cross guard at the base of the blade. I did this because I wanted this dagger to look less fancy and look a little more like a simple traditional sailor's tool. I used my X-Acto knife to punch a hole in the center of the crossguard to slide it over the fiberglass core, and then I adjusted the hilt of this one by using my box cutter to cut a slight indent at the top and bottom so that it wasn't simply a straight handle all the way down. I then cut out a pommel weight using the same copper pipe method and used contact cement to glue both the pommel weight and the crossguard to the hilt. I created the blade for this dagger in the exact same way as the last one, with the 2 pieces of 5mm craft foam with the groove down the center, although for this one I wanted it to be a single-edged blade, so instead of the centered point, I cut from one corner down towards the other to create a curved edge on one side. Since this blade was single-edged, it had the added difficulty of having a cut that went across the hole for where the core was supposed to be. So I cut a tiny piece of craft foam and plugged that hole using super glue, and then cutting and sanding until the whole thing fit flush. Then, just like the last dagger, I took this one outside and went over all of the edges and hand sanded areas with my rotary tool. I just did a slight sanding along the back edge where it's not supposed to be sharp, but as you can see, the angle is a lot steeper on the blade side, and then again smoothing out the hilt, rounding out the edges of the crossguard, etc., etc. Once I finished the construction of both daggers, I moved on to painting. I started with 2 coats of watered down Elmer's glue because I couldn't find my Mod Podge, which I would suggest if you don't have Mod Podge, but I did eventually find my Mod Podge and then finished it off with 1 or 2 more coats of that, which in my experience is much easier to apply, so I would recommend that if you don't have it. I would have normally gone with Plastidip, but it is too cold outside for Plastidip right now, and still was when I was making these earlier, so I had to work with what I could do inside. I then painted the entire thing in a base of black acrylic paint. This was both because I wanted the handles of both daggers to be black, but also because black acrylic is a very good base for metallic paints. Once I had applied the black acrylic, I then went over with a metallic silver and covered the blade, crossguard, and pommel weight on this dagger. After I had painted the blade on the other dagger, I used gold rub and buff to go over the pommel weight and the handguard. That allowed the handguard to have sort of a weathered, dirty look that I appreciated, but I did eventually end up going over it one more time with a cover of a cheaper gold acrylic paint that I had, which helped sort of even out the color and brighten it up a little bit. And then I knocked my camera over. And there you go. 2 different styles of pirate dagger that I used in my short film. If you haven't seen my short film yet, please go check out my personal channel. There will be a link to it in this video and in the description. It is a sword fight based on dialogue from a Shakespeare play. I'll also be hopefully uploading more short films to that channel, as well as tutorials for how to make the props from each one, so keep an eye out for those on this channel and on the other one. If you liked this video, leave a thumbs up. And if you're new here, consider subscribing if you want to see more tutorials like this. I also have a bunch of other tutorials I've done on other prop and costume related things, so feel free to check those out. And thank you for watching.